Hey everyone, welcome to episode number 1 of the Ancient Presence podcast. In today's show, we spoke with Ben from UnchartedX and had a great conversation about the mysteries of ancient civilizations, the mathematics of the Great Pyramid, the catastrophic landscapes of the channeled Scablands, and a whole bunch of other cool stuff. So if you guys enjoyed the video, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, share our videos with your friends, and hope you guys enjoy the show. Well, all right. Today we've got Ben on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today, man. This is officially our first podcast on Ancient Presence, so we're happy to talk with you today, and welcome to the show.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, well, I'm honored, and it's great to be your first guest. Yes, yeah. Hi, Milo and Casey. How you guys doing?
We're doing good. Other than, like I told you before the show, I broke my arm the other day, so unfortunately here on the screen I got this funny little cast on, but life is beautiful, and all I can do is accept it and still enjoy my life. And so
it made setting
good.
up this podcast really interesting.
Yeah.
Him having one arm, I'm like the Sherpa, like getting everything. It's been funny.
Yeah, I'll bet. Yes, make my tea, Casey.
Yeah.
He calls me his butler, Reginald.
Reginald, yes, Reginald. Don't ring a little bell.
Yeah. But yeah, man, it was really great meeting you a couple months ago on the Scablands tour with Randall Carlson. We had a fantastic time. We were a great group. It was really great for us to come and kind of tune in with other YouTubers like you and the Snake Brothers and the Grimerica guys, and kind of welcome ourselves more into this podcast world and start to connect and talk more with people who are really studying the ancient world like we are. And it's just great, man. I love that we can produce content where people who have a lot of questions and who are exploring the world and traveling and filming. And it was a great opportunity to come, for the Scablands tour. That was just fantastic. So we're happy we got to meet you guys.
Yeah, it was. I enjoyed that trip a lot. When was that? That was last year now, I guess. So Scablands trip, September. Mm-hmm. September of 2021. Good times. Yeah, so Randall does those tours up in the channeled Scablands. I've done a couple of them. In fact, I'm part of their the Contact at the Cabin group now. So I'm going back again this year to the other Scablands trips. It's going to be it's always a good time having kind of Randall as a guide for going around the Scablands. It doesn't really get any better than that. Like he's really the master when it comes to that stuff. And like you said, it's just they've always seemed like really good trips or really interesting people. It's same thing with the tours in Egypt and Peru and everywhere else. Like people that are interested in this topic. I find it's been my experience across all of these trips. I've done a couple of the Scablands trips now, but also Egypt and Peru and things where you put a group together. It's like I kind of call it like a self-selecting group of just cool people. Like everyone that's sort of tapped into those channels that talk about these trips and that want to go on them are generally going to be open-minded, interesting people that are really, you can talk about all sorts of stuff and get into all sorts of different topics, and everyone's really friendly and welcoming. So yeah, it was a great time. And it was fun jamming with you too. I suppose jamming for you off the table for a little while now, Milo. Yeah, but yeah, good times. Even we didn't have a lot of time to jam, but yeah, I'd love to do that some more sometime. That was so much fun. It's actually secretly my favorite part of those Scablands trips is the fact that I can drive there and bring like the drums and stuff and get to play music with people. It's a good time.
Nice.
Heck yeah. And it's a really good thing for us as a channel too, because that was kind of our first, like we've spent a lot of time exploring these places and making videos, but we haven't really hung out with or interacted with many people who do the same. And so like just being around other YouTubers who are kind of in the rhythm of making educational videos is really helpful for us, and just to get just having conversations and understanding how to do YouTube better is even just a great thing, let alone interacting with people who share a shared interest.
Yeah, it's fun to talk about that. Actually, I enjoy the same thing too. I've gotten to know a few of the other ancient history kind of community, I guess, on YouTube, the content creators. Mm-hmm. It is good fun talking about that stuff, and it's I think there's a real benefit to kind of getting to know everyone and cross promote. I mean, you guys, I did you guys produced a fantastic video on the back of those Scablands trips. Like,
thank you.
If anyone hasn't seen, I mean, go and watch Ancient Presence's video on the Scablands. It's a really good, something that I've been meaning to do. It's on my long list of projects to get to, a similar type of thing, which puts, because Randall has a style of, it's a very methodical style. Randall, he's full of information, but you can watch him for hours and hours and hours, and he'll slowly build up that picture. But it's like, I think there's definitely room for something that puts together the overall picture of the mega floods and the cataclysmic destruction that happened up there, and kind of what actually happened to the landscape. And you guys did a great job with that. And it's, I mean, as far as like drone footage and a place to like spectacular landscapes, it doesn't get much more spectacular than the Scablands. If people haven't been there, go. Yeah. I mean, I know people that live in Seattle that don't know anything about it. I'm like, just drive a few hours to the east, and your mind will be blown. Like it's one of the most spectacular landscapes on the planet, and it's it becomes even more spectacular once you understand what actually took place there not that long ago.
So you mentioned that you're going to be on another tour with Randall coming up, and that's the one that's going to be in Montana, right? That in Idaho, near the ice dam, right? Yep. Well, cool.
That's nice. Right. Yeah. So it's like kind of tracking the flood to the east and going up to the the alleged the glacial Lake Missoula area, looking at the flood path that way as well. But I think we're also going back to the Scablands again in September. Oh, sweet. I'll be on both those trips, I believe. But I'm looking forward to that one getting up. I've not actually been I've not seen that part of the US from at all. I don't think I've ever been to Montana. So,
I'd love to get out there too.
It's going to be cool.
Yeah, I'd love to see the Montana zone, Lake Missoula, where it came through the Clark Fork River, where the ice dam apparently broke. Right. It's just such a gigantic landscape, man. It's like you said before, with listening to Randall and reading about his studies and watching his podcasts and YouTube channels and reading Graham Hancock's books. It takes hours and hours and months and years to try to get an idea and an understanding of what took place across that landscape. And like you said, in our video, our goal was to try to put it all under one roof and just kind of touch upon the main points and show kind of from top to bottom in one spot on one video what happened across that landscape. Because personally, I've spent, countless tens and tens of hours researching this stuff and listening to Randall's podcasts, and you get little bits of information here and a little bit there and a little bit there, and it's hard to put it all together. Right. And it took up until going on this tour until it really hit me oh my God, now I get it. Now I see how big this flood really was. And even after years of studying this stuff, I still didn't quite understand it. But we drove hundreds and hundreds of miles. After the tour with you guys, we went down the Columbia Gorge and went to Crown Point, and that's 300 miles from Soap Lake. And it would have been underwater, and it's 730 feet high. I don't know if you remember the video, or maybe you've been there, but it was still underwater, 700 feet, and it's 300 miles away. And it flooded all the way to Eugene, Oregon, that whole lake there in the Willamette Valley. It's just unbelievable, the amount of water that came through the Scablands and the Columbia Gorge. It's just incredible. And it didn't even stop there. Once it hit the ocean, it went, as super dense, hyperpycnally generated turbidity currents is the technical term. It went down across the seabed and went 600 miles and left a 400-foot deep layer of sediment 600 miles away, which is unbelievable.
That's insane.
It's absolutely crazy.
That was one of the big takeaways that I tweaked to as well on that. It kind of relates to the concept of an ancient civilization that was lost during a cataclysm, or maybe even before, who knows, but remnants of, if there was a global civilization or something that was, a precursor to civilization as we know it. And I really internalized that fact when you talk about the sediment layers, because even driving through those coulees, even you've got these cliff walls on these coulees that are 700 feet high or whatever, but you're standing on a few hundred feet of sediment, and that's all this flood-borne sediment. And as you said, once all that, those floods, which people tend to think of them as water, it's more like thin concrete. It's just so full of mud and forests and icebergs and just chunks of stuff. You wouldn't have survived, but gravel and all of that washed out, and that whole, that that coastal region where the sea level rose like to 300 to 400 feet over this whole period. That was, as you said, buried in hundreds of feet of sediment. So people are like, well, if there were, if there was cities or settlements or construction that probably would have been on those coastal regions where it would have likely been warmer and more habitable during that glacial maximum, then that's now buried. It's not like just a simple matter of let's go explore the coastal regions. Like, no, that stuff in a lot of areas is going to be buried under like up to a few hundred feet of sediment, or it's just smashed to rubble from this massive force of this flood that came down there. It's just, I sort of internalized that because I thought, there must be places around the planet in these coastal areas that have some remnants of stuff, but it's like in a lot of cases it's likely all been smashed and buried in sediment as a result of these floods. I mean, people, like I said, sea levels rose during this period a couple hundred feet up to the level that they're at now. So it's just, I don't know how many, I guess it's got to be in the billions of sort of cubic miles of water or something, whatever it took to raise sea levels that much. I mean, it's inconceivable amount of water coming off the continent in a really short period of time. And that's, so for anyone that hasn't looked into this flood theory, I mean, that's this catastrophic melting that happened at the end of the glacial maximum, or at the end of the Pleistocene, sort of 12,800, 900 years ago. And there's always been a source of speculation as to what was the source for the melting, like what caused all this stuff to melt so catastrophically.
Yeah, well, I'd say that Randall's ideas explain it very well. There are a lot of questions we still have for him about, like, for example, the when we went to the what's the canyon called?
Devil's Canyon.
Burlingame.
The one that was on the private property.
On the that guy's private land.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, in there you've got that layer of ash from Mount St. Helens, which I believe dates to 14,900 years ago or something, and they could date it. But there's a lot of controversy about whether it was induced into those layers from aerial deposit or from water. And I don't know if you've read the article called Back to Brett's. It was from John Shaw. He's showing that that ash and those deposits were actually brought in by water, not from the air, which I still don't quite understand then if the ash was deposited somewhere else, if it was maybe a few thousand years earlier and then it was deposited into those layers. I mean, there's so many questions, and I know Randall's read basically every article ever written about the Scablands, and we're hoping to have him on the podcast soon. We got like a whole list of questions for him, but I'd say that his ideas do explain it quite well, that if there was one major catastrophic flood and then perhaps, a whole bunch of series of other smaller floods, it does make sense. And it's really interesting, like you'll be going to Montana this year, where you can see evidence of catastrophic inflooding of Lake Missoula, where the standard theory is that it was a slow melting of the glaciers that were filling up the lake. But it doesn't make sense that at the same time it's warm enough to rain and melt enough water to fill up this huge lake, the ice dam kept fortifying itself at the same time. I mean, it makes more sense that Lake Missoula was actually perhaps only there for a few days or a week also, and that it was catastrophically infilled and then catastrophically drained along with the Scablands flood all in one go. So, yeah, it's really fascinating. There's a lot of controversy about this, and you got to be careful when you make videos and make bold claims, but we like to ask questions, and it's certainly fun to explore all these possibilities for sure.
Yeah, I'm the same. That's pretty much how I operate too. I typically just want to ask the questions, and so I think there's a lot of open questions like this when it comes to our past. I mean, as you say, there's the whole glacial Lake Missoula thing's fascinating to me, and I'd learned a few things again from Randall, and I'd had him on my podcast a couple times, and we'd gotten into like a lot of the theory around ice dams. So there's a number of problems with the whole glacial Lake Missoula theory. One being as you say, the ice dam issue. It's like, how do you get all of this rainfall? And it was, the standard model says it's something like 100, 150 years to fill that up each time. And each time it was like this big flood, because the standard model says they now accept that it was mega floods that caused the channeled Scablands, but rather than it being one event, it's like 19 or what, I'm not sure on the number.
They've said up to 47, up to 82, up to 90, up to 47, perhaps even 100 and something. I mean, the number keeps growing. It's like insane that it would happen once, let alone 90 times.
Yeah, they're like tweaking it to go back towards this multiple floods model. It's silly, but But so the idea is that took 100 years, 200 years, whatever, to fill this each time. As you say, at the same time, this glacial lake reforms, and it's a span of like 6 miles or 3 or 4 miles or something. And there's just, the depth of the water and the hydraulic pressure at the bottom of that, just none of that makes any sense from what we know of the dynamics of ice dams. And there's a lot of papers and things that Randall gets into about this. Like, it's just, we've never seen ice dams that behave this way. It's theoretically, there's a lot of challenges with it, let's say. But one thing that I recently learned that really supports this idea of it being sort of catastrophic inflooding and only being there for a short amount of time is that there's just no evidence of any marine life whatsoever in Glacial Lake Missoula or in that area. There's nothing. You'd expect to see like frogs or remains of animals and like sort of marine animals in a lake body of that size, but there's just nothing that supports that. There's no erosion that shows the action of like small wave action that you typically get in lakes and stuff that are on the lake shore. That you would find in these types of lakes, or even these lakes that were there that in that period of time. None of that's there, and I also like the idea of what Randall talks about it. So you got to imagine this, because it's so choked with debris, like this back flooding and inflooding. As all of this flood happens and it takes entire forests with it, I mean, it would have caused all sorts of blockages on its path towards the ocean in various locations. And that's also the explanation for Burlingame Gulch, right? That he talks about, that this was a number of sort of backflood sediment layers that were dropped because there's stuff that would block up, and it would cause backfilling of all of these reservoirs on the path out until the pressure got to a point such that it sort of cleared the block and away we go again. But then the next block happens. So it's a really, it's like this, not a single consistent flood. It chokes itself constantly and backfills and then washes through, and probably happened over a period of a couple of weeks or a couple of months to carve that landscape. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to getting up to Glacial Lake Missoula and getting into some of those topics, because I think Randall's onto something with his, as you say, with his model and what he's proposing around Glacial Lake Missoula, that it was never actually a lake. It may have just been like a holding pond, I say, like it's one of the huge reservoir of water, a couple of 1,000 feet deep. Yeah, it's open questions, and I hope he's working on. I hope he puts his theory together and he writes his paper or writes his book.
He said he's working on a paper,
retiring from his day job. So
yeah, I'm looking forward to that paper.
Yeah,
I'm really curious. I'm going to read through that thing and comb right through it and check all the references and whatnot that he puts in there. Because as far as I know, he hasn't published any official scientific papers in any journal. He's not technically not a what do you call it? He doesn't have a PhD in geology or anything, but I'd say he has more knowledge than most academics. I mean, he's just a brilliant man. Say again?
Oh, yeah.
What'd you say? He has a degree or no?
I was going to say he does have a degree, and he went back and did that because I think someone was criticizing for it, so he just went and got I think he has a degree in geology, but
okay.
Yeah, I mean, Randall, look, he's a legitimate genius. Like he's someone.
Oh
that,
yeah.
In my opinion, at least, he's genius. Like
for sure,
genius when you meet it. I think he's a genius, and I know Graham Hancock says the same thing about him.
Yeah,
and he's often put that out there where he's open to kind of debate and discussion with anyone that wants to talk about this stuff with him, of standard model versus his model, and I've seen him do that in action, like with some of the experts that are up there at the visitor center at Dry Creek or Dry Falls. And there's you couldn't find somebody that's probably more well read and educated on a lot of these topics. And
it's true.
Yeah.
I mean, he and not only with geology, but with mythology, with geometry, studying the ancient mysteries. He's obviously a Freemason. The knowledge in his mind about ancient biblical numbers and the New Jerusalem and all these, like how it all meets together
Gothic
into
architecture.
Yeah, exactly. He knows more about Gothic cathedrals than anyone I've ever heard speak out. It's just fascinating. Like one of my jokes on the tour was that Randall's like the perfect wind-up toy. I just ask him a question and wind him up with like a question or two, and then he just goes off talking for half an hour, and I just put the microphone in his face, and just love that. I love listening to his stream of knowledge. It's like, where does he store all that? I don't understand. Like I've got a lot of knowledge in my mind as well, but it's hard to recall all the dates and times and which article was produced in which year by which geologist. And he's got that all up there. Like it's profound.
He does.
Yeah.
He's astonishing to talk to. Go ahead, Casey, sorry.
One video that we were diving into of yours yesterday, and we've been kind of over the last 10 years, we both, Milo and I, have been really fascinated by all of the numbers that are encoded into the Great Pyramid. And yesterday we were diving into one of your videos where you kind of went over a lot of those things. And we've seen Randall go over a lot of it, and like Alan Green and many different people explore these things. Mm-hmm. And I find that such a big mystery of like a lot of these ancient sites, and especially the Great Pyramid, is that it's encoded with such precise calculations of the Earth and of other fascinating things that we're just coming to know about, like E and pi and all of these things. And I'm just curious, like, what is your thoughts about all of that, and like why? Do you think they intentionally created it as a model of those things?
It's a good question. So it's how to get into it. So what you're talking about, first of all, is the pyramid keeps sort of giving up these secrets, and it seems like it's another. I can point people to another documentary that also does an excellent job of exposing kind of some of the insane geometry and sacred geometry, I guess is the other word for it, that's in it, which is Builders of the Ancient Mysteries, Patrice Pouillard, who created Revelations of the Pyramids. He's a French filmmaker, a friend of mine as well that I've had the chance to talk with a whole bunch. A fantastic video that gets into some of the dynamics of the upper chamber, the King's Chamber. But the thing that you're talking about, and it's probably one of my favorite aspects of the Great Pyramid, is that it's essentially a scale model of the Northern Hemisphere, or even of the Earth, right? So you have a I think it's 44,000. I can't 44,000. See, if it was Randall, he'd reckon
43,200.
200. There you go. Thank you. So the
432.
Yes. So you have the circumference times that is the equatorial radius of the Earth, and then the height of it multiplied by that number gives you the polar radius of the Earth. So you have some direct relationships at that constant ratio to the dynamics of the planet. But the thing that gets me about that is the socle, as you said. And the socle is kind of this. Yeah. It's a foot high almost. It's like a base that the pyramid sits on. It's like there's two ways of measuring like the height of the pyramid, and it's think of it as like a small pedestal that it was kind of built into, and you can see it around the edges of the pyramid still, but you can measure it from the base of the pyramid or from the base of the socle, and there's like a roughly a foot of difference in height. But what is crazy is that if you take the circumference or the perimeter measurement of the pyramid of its base, and you then compare it to the perimeter measurement of the socle, because it's a little wider, that ratio is the exact same ratio of latitude to longitude on the planet. Now, this is an interesting thing. The planet's not a perfect sphere. It's an oblate spheroid. We're a little bit wider around the equator than we are, north-south kind of circumference-wise, because we bulge a bit with the spin of the planet. So when you look at a grid of latitude and longitude on the planet, your east-west measurements of each sort of square are a little bit longer than the north-south measurements. And so that's the difference between latitude and longitude. And that same ratio of latitude and longitude on the planet is reflected precisely in the ratio of the socle versus the perimeter of the pyramid. And this has all these implications to it, because longitude itself is a very difficult thing to measure. So ancient seafarers we're fairly good about using the stars and the sun to measure latitude, so north-south positioning. But we couldn't really measure east or west very accurately until kind of the start of the 19th century, James Cook's second voyage of discovery. And this is because you need very accurate chronometers or watches to measure east-west measurement, to measure longitude accurately, so to position yourself where you are. In fact, ancient seafarers they would travel north and south to fix their position accurately, and then they would call it running down an easting or running down a westing, and they would head due east or due south in the direction they wanted to go, just because they couldn't measure longitude accurately. And again, it's something that we technologically only ever gained the ability to do accurately at the start of the 19th century in our civilization. Yet you have very accurate measurements of longitude and an understanding of longitude encoded into the pyramid. So, that's the question is how. This is where one of my big open questions about ancient civilizations, and in particular in Egypt, is that, and it's not just that with the pyramid, right? There's the speed of light's encoded into it, phi, the golden ratio, pi. There's so many of these sort of fundamental constants of nature that seem to be encoded into the monument that make me really question and this is stuff that's well and truly beyond what we understand of the dynastic Egyptian civilization. Like they were a great civilization. They knew an awful lot, but I don't think we have a full understand. Like a lot of this stuff is beyond their technological reach or beyond their capability as far as we know it, right? So some of this stuff is outside of what we know of their knowledge base. So it's like, how did these things get into the pyramid? It's a lot of people and a lot of the mainstream academics will say that it's just a coincidence, but these coincidences keep stacking up, and that's a little hard to accept for me. And then something else I've learned recently is that it's not just the Great Pyramid. Like there's a whole it's called something called the megalithic system of measurement. And this was I should have brought the book with me, but there was a guy that did a whole, like, he spent 40 or 50 years measuring like megalithic stone circles in the UK around this area, and he discovered that those are also laid out in a very precise system of measurement with consistent ratios and consistent measuring units that tie in very closely with the true motions of the heavens and of the earth. And I'll have to find the references for that and talk a bit more about it, because it's just coming off the top of my head at the moment. But it seems like ultimately there was some of the people responsible for at least the foundational work in a lot of megalithic structures around the world had a far greater understanding of the planet, of the motions of the heavens, of the environment, and even of the universe when it comes to things like the constants, the speed of light, and stuff like that. So that doesn't particularly fit with our understanding of ancient civilizations as we know them, the ones that started from 6,000 years ago till now. So all of these things to me point to, like, okay, so either we've completely misjudged ancient civilizations like the dynastic Egyptians, and they may have been far more knowledgeable and far more capable than we know, or they didn't do it, and maybe they inherited some of this stuff, and these things are here longer. So that's where I think the story of cataclysm really ties in, the Younger Dryas, the flooding. We've got all sorts of other evidence around, our genetic timeline as a species keeps getting longer and more complex with all of our cousins, Denisovans and Florienses, and we've seemed to have been here for a long time. And then you have all of the technological evidence, which is the other thing I focus on in my video. There seems to be work that can only be the result of some fairly advanced technology and machining and things like this. So I think there's a lot of these things in the pyramid and that stuff. So it's a long way to answer your question, but I think a lot of this stuff points to this possibility that there was a bit more going on in the past than we think. And I think where it leaves me is a bunch of open questions. Like I'm trying to pose the questions. I don't have the answers, but it seems to me that we're left with a situation with one of two possibilities, which is either we've misjudged the ancient civilizations as we know it, and they're far more capable and advanced than we thought they could have been, or they didn't do it and they inherited it from somebody else. But in either case, I think we need to kind of go and reevaluate those very earliest parts of our roots as civilization. So,
yeah. I mean, we agree with a lot of that. For sure, there was a lot more knowledge in the past than the mainstream academics want to acknowledge, which I find a bit strange because you can't really argue with mathematics. And they, right. A mainstream Egyptologist will deny that you can find the ratios of pi or the golden ratio inside of the Great Pyramid, for example. But these are not mathematicians who are telling us this information. They're saying, no, you can't find it there. Whereas mathematicians will look at that and say it's there. Like, you can't really argue with the math. So, right.
Right.
We have a lot of disagreement with the mainstream, version of history. And I know you do as well. And that's kind of what led us on our whole path of discovery, is trying to find like what is the truth about the ancient world. Obviously people in thousands and thousands of years ago had amazing levels of knowledge and sophisticated measure of the earth that we've only more recently been able to match with satellites. So that leads you to question, did the ancient people have a form of high technology in order to achieve this, or were they just really great seafarers and, like studied and measured the earth, astronomers and whatnot, through more kind of simplistic ancient methods? And, for the longest time, I was really much more interested in the idea that there was an advanced civilization with a high form of technological capability. But I've come to kind of maybe or just contemplate, maybe it has this knowledge came from people who were actually more basic and more simplistic in their approach to studying and sailing around the world and measuring the earth and then encoding all these mathematics into ancient monuments. Who knows? I mean, just because we didn't study or figure out longitude officially till like the late 1700s, and like you said, Captain Cook's second voyage, when we could create time-telling devices that were able to navigate and sail across the oceans with fluctuating movements inside of the boats that could accurately continue to measure time and calculate time, so you can know how far you're sailing east and west. Just because that's how we had to figure it out.
Maybe another method.
Yeah, there could be, and it might be more simplistic than mechanical devices. So basically, we have to disagree with the mainstream and say, obviously, the ancient peoples had much more knowledge than mainstream Egyptologists, for example, are willing to give them credit for. But how did they get that knowledge? And who found it? Was it actually the Egyptians that figured out all this incredible mathematics and study of the earth and the precise calculations of latitude and longitude and the polar radius and the equatorial circumference of the earth and encoded that into the pyramid? Or was the knowledge given to them, or were they actually inheriting this knowledge from their ancestral civilization before them, their predecessors, who they're kind of the continuation of? I mean, these are all great questions, right? But we have to definitely say that someone back then had amazing knowledge of the earth and the cosmos and of divine mathematics, and that just doesn't quite fit into history. So that's kind of where I'm going with my curiosity is,
that's right.
Was it simplistic, kind of primitive-ish people who figured all that out? And was it always kind of like kept secret or kept within initiate schools throughout the history of Egypt and the Romans and the Greeks and European civilization?
So this is something that came up in our talk with Grimerica as well, is like, we often say like primitive or like that they weren't advanced because they didn't have the technological symbols that we have today. We don't look at it the same as like, if they didn't have an iPhone, they weren't advanced. And so
right.
One way I've been kind of rethinking it or reframing a lot of ancient history is like they were advanced, and the technology of even spiritual connection to the cosmos, of like having an inner feeling of celestial cycles, in itself is a technology, is a developed sense.
Right.
And rather than looking externally to a device to tell them what a calculation was, they could have had an inner sense or an inner feeling of something that they developed through these spiritual practices, through religious ceremony, through what we now see as like something we've outgrown, which is like religiosity, where we're no longer connected to God or have a relationship to God in the same way. And we see the ancients that did have that as something that we've kind of evolved out of. And yeah, so I find it kind of curious that like my kind of perspective of like the Great Pyramid and all the things that are built into it is maybe that it wasn't even intentional. Like they didn't have the thought like, oh, we're going to encode pi and phi into this structure, but rather it was like almost like a bee building a honeycomb. The bee builds a honeycomb, which is,
right.
A hexagon holds the most amount of volume using the least amount of resources. And it encodes a cosmic principle that, I don't think a bee, had the thought like, I'm going to design this thing that looks aesthetically beautiful and also holds the most honey for us using the least amount of resources. It was a spontaneous created artifact out of their connection to nature's efficient design principles. And so likewise, how could these ancient people have designed artifacts that today we're just discovering their integrity of, and did it without having to think, oh, this is going to encode all of these masterful cosmic principles because we're geniuses. It was just, it was a side effect of them being connected spiritually to something larger than themselves.
That's a good point, and I was going to make a similar one, and that's right. I mean, things like the golden ratio show up in nature. Obviously, that's where it comes from. Is that it's sort of nature's building block. It shows up in artwork as well, like people that like artwork. I mean, people. It's just the correct proportionality and dimensionality of it's like of this bone to this bone in your arm kind of thing. Like it shows up in nature, in ourselves, but also in things like artwork, and certainly I think there's a possibility for some of those things being just inherently part of it, as you say. And in fact, so something that Hancock gets a bit of criticism for occasionally, all his critics like to bring it up, is that he goes down a similar line, and it's something I do too. It comes back to this idea of what is technology and what is this advanced capability that we talk of, and we tend to think of that as this. We look at it in our form of technology. It's I call it like this. We have this electrochemical approach to, or electrochemical approach to problem solving. Like that's how we have developed our technology in our civilization. But there are whole other realms of avenues that you could progress down in that would equal kind of technological advance in all these other dimensions of possibilities in the universe, right? We're going to know more in 100 years. We're going to know more in 1,000 years. There's lots of good examples of this. I always like to talk about things like xenic surface waves. There's a whole other theory of electromagnetic wave propagation, right? There's a whole, today we do Hertzian wave theory is what it's called. And so that's how we send signals and power over wires, and we like a wire without shieldings, an antenna, and we send signals through the air that way. Like everything's based on Hertzian wave theory. Everything that we do with power wires, signal. There's a whole other theory that was dismissed. This is an interesting tie into Tesla, because I think what he developed with his tower at Wardenclyffe was something based on xenic surface waves. There's a whole other theory of electromagnetic wave propagation called xenic surface waves, and it involves sending power or signal or the same type of thing through the interface between the surface and the air, more or less. And then you can think of it as kind of like a balloon that blows up around the whole Earth, and you can send power or signal effectively losslessly anywhere on the planet. If you just you have a generator for it, and then you plonk in your receiver, and it uses xenic surface waves to transmit. Doesn't need wires. Doesn't need any of the infrastructure that we have today. And so Tesla built this capability. It got classified after he died, and then there's a company in Texas that came out called Visive Technologies. Funnily enough, they're founded by some ex-military intelligence guys that came out, naval intelligence, I think, and got this started. Feels like they may have been chewing on his theory for a while, and they built like a Tesla tower in Texas that does exactly that. Like it's their global test site. They can take a receiver pretty much anywhere on the planet, plonk it down, and receive power and signal from it. But the example I like to use is like if someone had said, well, there's a way to send signal and power just through the earth, like through natural materials without any wires or any transmission medium required, people would go, that's just nonsense. Like that doesn't make any sense at all. Hocus pocus magic. But turns out, and recently we figured out, all right, there is something to that theory, and we've now changed our concept of what it means to send a signal somewhere. Like it completely changes the way we could think about things like electricity and how that gets used in our civilization going forward. And I'd like to think that maybe this theory is going to revolutionize power delivery in our civilization going forward. But that's my point. Like as far as our technological sort of perspective, like there is so much that sits outside of that. And as I said, Hancock kind of thinks about it as to, well, maybe they had some other connection to spirit, or they had some other sort of mental capacity that may have developed into technologies, and maybe that's something that's lost to us. I think there's no, we have to. It's very difficult when you look at a lot of these ancient sites and sort of certainly some of the evidence for technology. We tend to try and think of, well, what were the machines that did it, or how did they do this or do that? There may be methods that we just can't comprehend that were involved, that are entirely outside of our technological kind of perspective right now. And I think that's the kind of open-minded approach that's required to look at these sites. We have to kind of look at them and go, okay, if we can't explain this with the primitive methods that we know that these guys are using, like copper chisels and pounding stones and manpower and ropes, and wooden scaffolding or whatever. If it can't be explained by that method, then let's be open about trying to investigate them thoroughly using the full spectrum of tools and capabilities at our current at our current availability, or what we can currently bring to bear to the problem, because maybe we'll learn something. Maybe we'll discover something that leads us down the path of uncovering some other form of technology or some other discovery. But that's kind of not what happens, and that's my issue with a lot of the mainstream here is that it's a constant effort to my perspective of trying to slam a square peg into a round hole. It's just like, no, these are the tools and techniques that we know that they had, so therefore everything must be made by that. And like the example you used earlier of like having mathematicians talk about, well, you can't just say this stuff didn't exist because we can show that it exists. It's kind of there's all this proof that it exists. It's the same thing with a lot of the technological aspects. You've got all these engineers and craftsmen and construction experts that look at this stuff and scratch their head and go, there's no way that you can achieve A, B, C, or D using these methods. And you've got Egyptologists that have got really no understanding or qualifications in any of these engineering arts, just dismissing it and going, no, it doesn't. That's not right. These are the tools. This is the result. That's what happened. So you kind of have this impasse, and I just think we'd be better served with a much more open-minded approach to kind of trying to figure a lot of that stuff out. And that's mostly what I'm trying to do, is ask those questions and expose a bit of the I think a bit of the true mystery that's still involved in a lot of these ancient sites around the world. Because it's an endlessly fascinating subject the deeper you get into it.
Yeah, and a lot, especially with YouTube. So many people are vitriolic with their criticisms, and it's gotten to the point where I've been in the state of like, if we can't ask questions about a lot of this, and we can't explore things that where we can be wrong, where it's like I'm not for sure right about all these things, but just to ask questions and explore realms of like to make just basically explore things that seem ridiculous. That even if it's wrong, it pushes us into a new conversation and a new exploration of what's possible. And even the things that we were wrong about lead to new insights and connections. And so there's been this tendency of mine to like want to kind of stay safe in like a lot of the claims that we make and all of that, which I think is a good kind of discernment to have. But also like, how can we step outside of what's academically acceptable and be in the state of curiosity and a bit more openness to new possibilities? And it's a fine line. And I think, there's a lot to be said about both sides, and it's
I think it's happening. Like I honestly, I think that's, and I think this, we're all part of it. I think there's this battle that's gone, and it's a funny thing because it wasn't always the case. So one of the challenges that I tend to see, particularly with the mainstream academia, is, and there's a huge amount of pushback, and I was there when Graham Hancock tried to debate Zahi Hawass in Egypt in like 2000.
The great debate.
2015, right? And he just spat the dumb. He didn't want anything to do with it. So, and Graham's like, and I talked to Graham last year about it again. I did a podcast with him, and he said he'd still love to do that, and Zahi's got a lot to offer, etc. But there's a lack of that kind of rational debate now. And to my mind, there's a whole lot of like, there's nothing like on the mainstream side. There's no mystery here. They're very authoritative, and they're like, nope, that didn't. This is the way it happened with bronze, copper chisels and pounding stones, etc., and simple methods, and we don't care. There's a coincidence that all these ratios and all these constants of nature in the pyramid, and it's just there's a lack of willingness to even be open to the mystery that's involved here. And I think there's a lot of mystery. But what's curious is that it wasn't always the case like that, right? There was, if you go back to and one of my favorite characters in history is Flinders Petrie. And you go back and you look at the Victorian era kind of gentlemen explorers and Egyptologists of their era, and you read their works, and I've read most of what Petrie wrote. He was open to, and he understood when he was looking at something that he couldn't understand, he couldn't explain. And this is where I think, that he gets used a lot by the mainstream, because he's still one of the guys who they still reference his measurement work and his surveys of a lot of these sites as the best sort of official sort of measurements of a lot of these monuments and sites. But at the same time, they kind of dismiss a lot of things he said about ancient Egyptian tooling methods and machining, things like this. But he was pretty much open to that mystery, and you could see him kind of scratching his head looking at it going, I don't understand it. He was, in my mind, more of an engineer almost than an Egyptologist, one of the first people to ever apply modern engineering principles to what we were seeing. And funnily enough, that was only because we just developed those engineering principles to a point where we could even understand that there was a mystery here. But that's sort of all changed now. Now your mainstream academics aren't as willing to accept I think the mystery and the unknown. And I think that's partly because of this whole YouTube and the venue for the discussion has shifted. In Petrie's day, it was a very elite company, right? He would have these discussions in the academic halls of discourse, and he'd do it in letters to his colleagues, and they were the people that were talking about it. But now it's this open slather world of the internet where you can get punters like me and you guys just having to having an opinion and perhaps convincing people and gaining an audience. And that's, I think, in a lot of ways fairly threatening to that establishment. There was I was just in an article that came out in Input magazine recently that tried to frame some of this stuff up, and it was, it was me and Jimmy and Brian Forrester on one side, I think, and then a few of the kind of mainstream academics on the other, and they were kind of lamenting the fact that nobody wants to listen to them or something like this. That's the threat, and I think that's your current crop of academics that's what's led towards this authoritative responses. It's like there's no mystery here. It's like there's because there's the venue for the discourse has changed. It's online now, and I think this whole area has grown in popularity. More and more people are sort of seeing some of the obvious open questions, and they're speculating and they're questioning some of the official narrative. I think what is going to shift, and I have some hope for the future, is that if you look at guys like Hawass and Lehner and the real sort of stalwart academic mainstream figures, they kind of grew up in an era where they had to deal with some books here and there, and the books got into it. But it seems to the popularity of this and video sites like YouTube, and where this whole discussion has shifted out into the internet widely, is something that they've had to kind of get used to, or it's something that's happened during their careers, and they're sort of dismissing it. But I got to tell you, I get a lot of emails and correspondence from Egyptologists and archaeologists that are in school now, that are training. I think the people that are going to be the next generation of academics and tenured kind of establishment figures. And I think they have no choice, but they have to deal with a lot of these questions. They have to deal with the stuff that Hancock's saying, that Baival's saying, that all of these figures that are really, I think, questioning this narrative and doing it very effectively. I don't think you can just dismiss them anymore. And they certainly seem to be, at least the students and the younger generation seems to be a lot more open-minded to some of these questions. So I have some hope for the future that this will shift. Was it Planck's constant, or Planck's theory that science advances, one funeral at a time? It's not just it's not just in archaeology and Egyptology. It's in a lot of fields, but I do have some hope that the next generation are going to be more open-minded and more willing to embrace the unknown, and to then take a more open-minded look at some of these things, because I don't have the answers either. I'm trying to ask the questions, and I constantly say that we should be fully applying ourselves with open minds to trying to solve some of these questions, because you never know, we might learn something.
Well, and I think the more that mainstream academia and a lot of these academic journals and stuff become more open, they're not behind paywalls. Basically, it's what I see now is a lot of the alternative information is like easy to come across, and you can go on YouTube and find it and all these things. And I think the more that academic voices start to have fun YouTube channels and make a lot of their research papers easier to come across and study, it's like the more that I think we can all start to have these conversations in ways that doesn't feel like we're taking sides, where it's more like if you're exploring these things and access to academic journals is available, then we're all starting to understand like the wide spectrum of like curious mysteries that are surrounding these places, and we can all start to talk about them in ways that aren't I don't know. I just see like a huge polarization. And I think one of the missions that we have for our channel is to kind of bridge that gap where I'm not really interested in fighting with academia. I'm actually really intrigued by academia, and I have a part of me that really wants to dive into that world in some ways. And also there's a lot of things about it that turn me off. And so I think there's some evolution that I would really love to see, which is just all of us talking and creating relationships that don't have to be so polarized.
Yeah, there's a lot of nuance, right? I mean, it's not just this side or that side is right or they're wrong. And if we choose sides and we're ready to die on the hill we're standing on, then we're just going to create enemies and we're going to fight against them, and then they're going to criticize, and then we're going to insult each other's characters, and then before you know it, we're not actually progressing in any way, scientifically. But it's a bummer, man. Like the way that anytime there's something that we find that's wrong about the mainstream theory, it's easy for a lot of people to shout, "Oh, it's aliens," or they jump to like extraordinary conclusions pretty rapidly, rather than taking a nuanced approach and trying to discuss it in a really logical manner. But interestingly, like if the mainstream Egyptologists, for example, would fund more research, we could address these questions rather than only having the works of people like Christopher Dunn, who have had limited resources and limited time and limited permits to go into places like the Serapeum with a couple of straight edges and a precision square and a precision straight edge. If the Egyptologists would address that head on and actually fund, for example, a major analysis with like laser scanning technology and figure out how precise are these boxes, we could solve the answer pretty quickly. It's just they're not interested in doing that. And then people think that there's a conspiracy, that they're trying to hide the truth. And then it just creates this polarization that goes on and on forever. So I find it really interesting to see like both sides of the debate. And like Casey said, we're trying to find our way into the middle, and we don't want to create any enemies. We're very loving people. And I think, people are going to defend their opinion as soon as they, find that they have enough conviction in their research, and it's just unfortunate to see like so much fighting involved in it all. But I would just really love to see some more proper investigation done. Then we could really get to the heart of the matter, and find out how precise are the boxes in the Serapeum? How flat is the sarcophagus inside Khafre's pyramid? Like I would love to go in there myself and measure these things, but I guess you bought some precision straight edge. I remember seeing in your podcast with Christopher Dunn.
Yeah.
Have you brought that to Egypt? Have you like studied and measured stuff?
You can't. Well, so everyone on the tours, we have people that do bring some tools. We do some basic measurements, but you can't. And one thing I have done on the last couple of trips is I've brought a lidar scanner, just the iPad, the Apple version, which isn't. You kind of have with lidar. There's the the iPad version, which and iPhones is like $1,000 device, and then the actual stuff you want's like the $60,000, $70,000, $100,000 laser scanners, which as you, and this is exactly what the same sort of thing I call for is that we should be using these tools to measure them. Like Patrice Poyard in Builders of the Ancient Mysteries went and used one of these things in the Barbara Caves in India, and absolutely mind-blowing results out of just how precise and flat and geometrically perfect these caves are, and symmetrical, and like just opens up a whole realm of questions about how these caves were made. And that's because he used like a $80,000 lidar scanner to get to give you that sort of absolute precision result, which is the sort of thing we're talking about. And that's and I've said exactly the same thing. Like, we should be scanning all these boxes. We should be going and scanning the statues, the faces.
Yeah.
There's so many, and it's so crazy that when you get into things like the tube drills, we only have one example to work with, because that's in the Petrie Museum, and they've actually let people like Christopher Dunn handle it. Versus, there's lots of other tube drill cores and tube drills on sites. There's lots of examples of this stuff, but because they're behind, the control of the antiquities department, they don't let anybody touch them. They don't want anyone investigating them. They don't let anybody actually go and ask those questions. And I think, honestly, it's to me, it's counterintuitive. Like, you would grow the interest in Egypt, and you'd grow the interest in more tourism if you admitted some of the mystery, and if you went and investigated this stuff. And I bet you there is no end of either engineering departments or university groups that would be more than willing to fund and to go and conduct a lot of that research, because it's sorely lacking. Like, same as that video where we found these gaps underneath the causeway at Khafre. How come we haven't dragged a ground penetrating radar system up and down the Khafre causeway? Like, all this debate about, is there chambers under the Sphinx? Is there this? Is there that? Like, we can answer those questions.
I love your video. You guys are just pouring sand into the crack and pushing the sand in there, and it just keeps going and going. I mean, it's like, that's pretty solid evidence that there's something down there.
Yusuf was doing that when he was a little kid. Yeah. And then there's probably sand's been blowing in there for, I don't know how many hundreds of years, thousands of years maybe. There's definitely a cavity down there. So it's, I think there's some easy layups for like Egyptology and for these guys that control the access to these sites. But as you say, like, I can't bring a straight edge onto Giza. Like, you can't bring any steel tools; they confiscate them. I don't want to get anyone in trouble, and I don't want to break any of the rules either. So I do the best that I can with the lidar devices that I've got. And we've certainly made some interesting observations. In particular, in places like the Aswan Quarry. I've got a video coming up about that soon, with some really interesting observations as a result of those scans.
They're pretty marks and things. Equidistant, right? Aren't they like a set distance between each little groove?
Very, very common. Not only that, there's really interesting effect when you look at the walls where there's scoop marks vertically on the wall, but as it moves out, they move kind of to an angle. So you can almost imagine an articulated tool that's anchored somewhere, and when you're scooping this way, it does this, but as you go out further and further this way, like, the angle changes, and you see that in these scoop marks. And then eventually maybe you move the tool and it straightens up again, but you see the angle, like the actual angle and orientation of the scooping marks actually changes in a pattern. So it's almost as if you could predict where this tool was located that did this, and you wouldn't have that effect if it was just some punter sort of hammering into the ground. There was a whole bunch of interesting stuff.
You could say you could line up like 100 dudes next to each other, which are each a shoulder width apart, and that's about the thickness of them. And maybe they were all hammering away with their pounding stones. But the angle is strange. I forgot about the angle. We climbed down in there. I don't know if you're officially allowed to go in there, but we tend to kind of jump over the ropes and explore and navigate our ways into the far reaches of the sites.
Ask for forgiveness rather than permission. Yeah, I operate the same way most of the
time. Or bakshish. Just hand him a couple.
Also,
that's the way it works.
At the Aswan Quarry, one thing that is still unanswered for me, and I haven't watched too many explanations of it either, but the test pits, the explanation is swinging a diorite ball to harvest this granite, and yet these test pits are 7 feet deep.
Smooth.
And they're,
some of them more.
If you're down in the pit, how do you swing the stone enough to be able to create the smooth sides and basically the pits that you see now using that method? I don't quite understand how that's explained.
Yeah. It's not. It's pounding stones. It's like they don't really explain a lot of the mysteries that you take a close look at it. I mean, there's the unfinished obelisk, but then there's the other obelisk where it's been scooped out underneath it, and sort of it's sitting on this blade of rock where they were starting to. But those scoop marks are not just horizontally here; they're above the head. So you would have had to have pushed up on these pounding stones to create that. It's crazy. I love the quarry. It's the only place where you are in Egypt, as far as I know, that you are forced to be indoctrinated before you go in there. Like, so if you haven't been to the Quarry, you're forced to sit down and watch like a 20-minute video where they kind of explain it, and Zahi's on there, and it's just like pounding. They show you the pounding stone method, and they've got a few pounding stones, and people can go out and wail on the granite for a while. And it's so implausible when you really look at the scale and the scope of this stuff, and you can get into the details of like, oh, how wide are they, and the angle changes. And I think there's a lot of open questions about this, but because they found a bunch of pounding stones and that fits the picture, like it just doesn't matter what evidence is there. It's like it was all done with pounding stones, and they're going to pound that idea into your head before you go in there. It's like the only place they force you to watch this video. And it's hilarious. And it's like, oh, it's okay, it was pounding stones. It's like this, you have to be indoctrinated before you go in there to prevent you from asking too many questions. But you know, Kyle from the Snake Bros made a really interesting observation about it. It was in those grooves, so in those scoop marks. What's interesting is like what he said is that, and it's why are there scoop marks with these raised lips? Because what he was saying, what he made a good point to me is like the level that you want to dig the granite out to is actually the level of where the lips come up. So you've got these indentations and these scoop marks that meet at a raised lip in the center, like between each of them. It's like a wave pattern. So the level you want to go down to is obviously the level that the peak is at. All of that pounding, all of that stuff in underneath it, like all that material is superfluous. Like you don't need to remove that much material. You would have pounded, if you wanted to cut it down to a flat level, you don't need to pound these scoops into it. You would have pounded it down to a point where it's basically flat. Like you wouldn't have kept on pounding for days and days and days to make these scoop marks when you only wanted to reduce the level down to like the height that's represented by where they meet on these lips. It's like, it's a great point. It's like you just, given that the rate of material reduction is so slow with this pounding method, there's no point in actually hammering it all the way down to make these scoops. You just wouldn't do that if you wanted to get it down flat. You could pound it relatively flat. So it's like another question, like how are these scoop marks there? Sorry, I interrupted you, Casey. You were going to say something.
Oh no, I was going to say something innocuous. Like that was the hottest place we've ever been.
Yeah, my God,
that being there at the quarry, direct sunlight reflecting off the granite. It was just like that was one of the hottest days of my life.
Yeah. Do you remember the filming we were doing there? Our cameras and iPhones kept overheating and stuff, so we'd have like a cold water bottle in the backpack, and we'd put one phone next to the cold water bottle to cool it down, and then we'd bust out the other phone and film for a few minutes until it overheated, and we'd shut it down and switch it with the water bottle one. And, oh my God, it was hot. Yeah, Egypt is very hot, especially once you get to Aswan. But oh my God, that was intense. Yeah, I mean, you're getting baked from the ground up and from the sky down. Like the granite just heats up, and it's like being in an oven out there. People might not quite realize.
That's hot. I've been there in July.
Oh yeah. We were there in what, June, right?
May, June. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's hot. Yeah.
Have you been out to?
It bakes the hell out of you.
Have you been out to Elephantine as well and seen the granite boxes out there?
Mm-hmm.
Those
did you climb in it?
Yeah, a few. I've been there a few times. Yeah. I've been in them and on them.
That's a fun climb. Oh my God, that place was baking me alive too. It was hot, touching the granite, climbing in there. I normally go around barefoot into a lot of places, so I had to wear sandals. Yeah, it was hot in there.
Yeah, so
that's an interesting place.
Sorry, there seems to be a little bit of a lag, but those boxes, like at Elephantine, and we saw one at Edfu as well, and the boxes at the Serapeum, it's mind blowing the scale of these boxes. I didn't quite realize that before we went to Egypt, like just how precise and huge they are. You know, single pieces of granite that it's pretty fascinating, especially at Elephantine because they're so big, and everything there is just like basically destroyed to a point of not existing anymore. And yet these granite boxes are there, just pristine looking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very interesting site.
Yeah, there's a long history to Elephantine Island. I have actually gone around to the off limits areas, and there's like the remnants of a small pyramid out there. There's a lot to see there. I like Elephantine because it gives you there's a real contrast of building styles. You have some of the big granite megalithic stuff like the boxes, but also some the remnants of like obelisks and pillars, and even like granite walls, kind of like the Valley Temple walls. And then you have like the later period building, which is much rougher, and even you've got Roman, Greek Roman Ptolemaic stuff there, like these really rough sort of columns that aren't straight, and they're small relative to a lot of the older stuff. I like the contrast that you see at Elephantine, and it has like one of the most spectacular single piece boxes that you see anywhere, really. And it's incredible how pristine it is. I mean, there's one that's been busted up, and you can see the marks where they, like a black granite one or granodiorite one, where they were trying to make a millstone out of one of the big flat pieces. But yeah, there's that one that's still complete. That's like the box that's in Edfu. Yeah, it's hard to think why they went to such effort. There's actually another interesting feature on that box, which is there's tube drills on the inside lips of the inside cavity, and it's just like, how do you drill? Like it's flush against the wall, like it's flush against the corner. So if you've ever tried to drill with a modern drill, like into a corner, you know it's very difficult to get it straight, because the drill actually hits the corner. You can't get the bit straight. You've got this machinery that's behind it that's pushing in there. That's a whole other challenge. Like, how did they actually make that thing in that corner? It's a challenge for anyone that did suggest any method of having it done, whether it was advanced or not. It's a huge challenge trying to get that tube drill in that corner where it is. Because you can't. It's not like it's a constructed piece. The granite was always there. Like the walls are always there. It's one single piece. So it's a real head scratcher. I've looked at that a bunch of times, and we've had some discussions about it. Like, it's like, well, somebody had something method of drilling out that granite that they could deal with that problem of actually putting it in a corner where you've got two walls of granite that kind of interfere with any tool or any bow if you're grinding a thing out of it or whatever.
That's definitely a peculiar one. Yeah, I mean, people have done a lot of experiments. We've been studying a lot in different YouTube channels and stuff. You and I talked about this before when I met you in Auburn. Which, by the way, thanks again for buying me lunch that day. That was very kind of you. It was really great hanging out. But we were talking about other people who have done tube core drilling experiments with copper tubes and whatnot. And it definitely can be done. I mean, there's no disputing that. But it makes you wonder, like, if in that corner, that angle you're talking about, flush against the two walls of granite within this really, strange kind of difficult region to work in, trying to imagine how someone might be able to do that with, say, a bow drill and maybe like a thin piece of wood that widens out at the end, so that only the copper is the widest section that has to fit into that narrow fitting and that right angle corner that it's
Possibly.
in. And if you could even sit there, I mean, we'd have to.
You still can't do a little bow drill like this.
Yeah,
because you got two angles. There's no angle to like run a bow across it. Like it to keep it straight. You can't. There's no angle to actually draw a bow back and forth across it. Yeah, and that's one thing. I mean, neither me, Petrie, Chris Dunn, anybody, and mostly I report on what Chris Dunn and Petrie say when it comes to the tube drills. No one, and that's the thing, no one's ever disputed that you can't grind out holes. Like Dennis Stocks has done the test, like with the tube drill. I mean, there's one of the video that I like to make poke a bit of fun at quite a bit is Dennis Stocks doing that. And I've got a sound clip on here that's like, that could be Fourth Dynasty, Dennis, when he pulls it out.
Yeah.
That no one's ever disputed that that's a method for making circular holes into granite. I mean, you can do it that way. The question is the fact that it doesn't match up with the marks that we see on the one single core drill that we have that people have actually been able to test, and Chris Dunn made a latex mold of it. Like, that's what we should be doing is going in and making latex molds of all of the holes that are on all of the sites. Like, Abusi is absolutely covered in these things. And just to the naked eye and to the photographs, you can see like it's a distinctive, heavy groove. Like, it's a solid groove into the walls of these tube drills. It looks spiral. We just don't know. And there's no end of also drill cores that are in the Egyptian Museum. Like, we should be looking at that, like you say. Like, this is all stuff that would be an easy answer if only people were willing enough to apply some very basic, non-destructive, scientific techniques to actually go on and look at it. Like, we can answer the questions. It's a matter of willingness of, I think, the people that control the access to these things to actually experiment and go and try and find the answer rather than just sort of ignoring it. That's the thing that annoys me the most about it. But that box at Elephantine Island would be another good example. You could do a latex mold, like clear it out of sand and scan it or latex mold it or whatever. Just but try and put some definition on the problem would be useful.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very intriguing debate. There's many people online now, not just Enistox, that are recreating these experiments and coming up with really fantastic results for tube core drilling, and also creating copper saws and actually getting really nice curved saw marks inside of granite and cutting straight through granite with just a simple kind of copper saw. And it's great to see alternative researchers, people on YouTube and whatnot, who are, furthering this research and this debate. It's definitely really intriguing, man. Like, we've studied a lot about, Christopher Dunn's work. I read his second book. I never read his first book, but The Lost Technologies of Ancient Egypt. And, part of our original fascination with our study of history and building our YouTube channel was there really a lost ancient civilization? How advanced could they have been? Were they, how advanced were these ancient people? Did they go back into the last ice age and beyond? And these are all obviously great questions, and kind of the main theme about the research of people like us that keeps us so motivated in this. So at first, when I was looking through Christopher Dunn's work, and Casey and I were spending a lot of time talking about it and watching your videos and watching other videos of people recreating the experiments and whatnot, I was really like wanting to super be convinced. I was like, oh my God, this is so fascinating. This is so far out. This is so interesting. This idea that people many, many thousands of years ago, or perhaps even, as Christopher Dunn says, the dynastic Egyptians themselves possessed machine technology that we just haven't found yet in the archaeological record. And the idea is incredible. And of course, anyone would want that to be true. Who wouldn't, But I've just become much more skeptical of that as time goes on, because I see alternative researchers progressing their experiments and coming up with pretty good results. And so at this point, I'm really undecided about any of it, because I'm just a guy on YouTube who's asking questions and talking about stuff. But I'm definitely want to keep a good, healthy, skeptical mind towards the idea that that there was some form of lost ancient high technology and machine cutting. Machines that could cut through granite with straight saws, with circular saws, with tube drills, all this kind of stuff. Because from what I'm seeing with the experiments that people are doing online, is that you can definitely recreate this stuff with ancient techniques. And so one of the other ones is how flat you can get a stone surface to be. And if you use the Whitworth 3-plate method, you can create
lapping. I understand.
Yeah, so when you look at like the boxes in the Serapeum, we only have a few measurements to go off. First of all, they're from Christopher Dunn. We need more measurements to know for sure how precise are they, how flat are they? Are they truly at like these precise 90-degree perpendicular orthogonal angles from the bottom of the lid to the side of the wall? And if so, like, how precise is it truly, and can you recreate that with primitive methods? And we often say, well, we haven't found the tools yet in the archaeological record, and that can kind of go both ways. If we haven't found any machine tools yet, of course the metal could have been melted down if there was some high ancient technology.
There's no metal left.
Yeah, because metal's a very valuable resource that people would have melted down to make other tools. But it also makes me wonder, if you use the same method of the Whitworth 3-plate method by grinding and lapping 3 stones together, I've heard you can also create a precision square that way. If you have 3 90-degree orthogonal pieces of granite that you're lapping against all the 3 separate surfaces, eventually you'll end up with perfect orthogonal, precision squares using that same method, perfectly flat and perfect 90 degrees. And as far as I've understood, we haven't found any of those in the archaeological record either, and they would be in stone if that was a primitive technique that was used. Yeah. So there's basically this kind of missing link in the archaeological record of how the hell did they do this stuff? And with the simplistic tools that we have found, it's difficult to explain it, but a lot of it can be explained with copper tube drills and whatnot. It's just there's still a lot of mystery involved in this, and the magnitude of it all is just, there is an ongoing giant question mark.
Yeah, there's some of it. You definitely, like as I said, with the tube drills and the grinding, there's methods that you can achieve some of the results. The trick is, and I encourage anyone, all the experimentalists out there to do it. I think it's all good, well-intentioned efforts to go and try and experiment with it. I address this stuff in my videos too, and Chris Dunn, and I'll always refer back to him in his book. he has kind of a 4-step test that talks about if you're going to the problem with a lot of it is, and people claiming that they've solved the problem, is it's in every case it's been just a matter of cherry picking certain aspects of the problem. The way to solve this is to actually take an honest evaluation of all aspects of what you're trying to do and replicate. You have to do a proper analysis of the ancient example first, including the most difficult aspects of the problem. And then you've got to go out and recreate this model using the tools and techniques that you claim were responsible for them. And then you have to honestly evaluate and compare the results. And those have to include the most difficult aspects of the problem. Things like the paper thinness of some of the vases, things like the perfect symmetry of some of the vases, the things like the relative geometry and flat planes of surfaces that are, in some cases in the boxes 10 or 11 feet apart. Those are a lot of those aspects of the problems are the ones that just get ignored or not addressed, as far as I'm concerned, in every example that I've seen. No doubt you can achieve astonishing results with primitive methods, and this is what a lot of people go out there and focus on. But what I'm looking for, and what I've not yet seen anywhere, and it's the same thing that Chris Dunn says. I mean, you have to really address it from a holistic perspective and look at all of the aspects of the problem, including the most difficult ones. And those are the ones that tend to get ignored or not specifically addressed. And it's just a long ass rabbit hole of details when you get into that space. And that's really a thing for the experimentalists to go and address, and to go and look at what Dunn's written about it and tackle it from that perspective, because he's the one who goes into all the detail about what it is. But I've talked to him about this, and I share the opinion, because I've seen some of these experiments and things as well, is that as I said, it's something that I've addressed in my videos in a few places. It's just like nobody's, to my mind, has satisfied those conditions. But it's great. It's great to see people experimenting and trying to do it. I think that's what we need to be doing. But at the same time, we also need to be defining the problem better. We just don't have enough. We just don't have the access to these objects to be able to define them. Like I said, I think a lot of it's never really going to get answered until we actually have the ability to properly measure and determine the degree of precision. How symmetrical are the faces of the Ramses statues? How perfect are the giant columns that, weigh 80, 90 tons? The palm-shaped columns, that are perfect. The one that it's at Bastet, for example. All of those types of things. We need to have more data before I think a lot of those engineering problems are ever really going to be solved. Otherwise, it's just it's kind of I don't want to say pointless, but it's we need to put the metrics around the problem properly first, and then we can go out and try and solve it. I think. In fact, I'd love to see there was a TV deal that evaporated, but we were talking about trying to do something just like that, like propose doing a competition of sorts, where it would be, we go and we measure some of these things, we get permission to do all of that type of thing, and then challenge engineering departments of universities to try and replicate some of them using various methods, see how far you get. I'd love to see something like that happen.
Yeah.
It would be very expensive. That's
as
a big
we've said
issue,
a few times,
is the price tag on all that stuff. You got to come up with a lot of money to get a giant chunk of granite and pay for all the hours of work. I would love to see it get done, though. I mean, if we could raise a few $1 million and
Me too.
Try to recreate a sarcophagus with perfect flat walls and orthogonal corners and all that, that would be pretty cool. I don't know where we'd get the money, though. But
Elon Musk, where you at?
Yeah, come on, Elon.
All right.
Another interesting thing is just how the hell did they move giant stuff? I mean, there's a few sites in Egypt that stand out far above the rest, and one of them specifically is the Colossi of Memnon. And as you know, the official theory is that those statues, which weigh 720 tons as they are now, before they were, as one single giant piece that was unfinished, they probably would have been 800 or 900 tons or even 1,000 tons. And
there was even bigger ones than those, but they're the ones that are still there.
Well, the Colossi of Memnon is, to me, the most interesting, because it's thought that they were carried over land 400 and something miles because they are too heavy to carry upriver on the Nile. Now, the statue at Tanis, for example, is probably more like 1,100 or 1,200 tons when it was one single piece. I mean, the archaeologist there told us it was between, what did he say, 25 and 30 meters or so, around 80, 90 to 98 feet or something, or like it's almost 100 feet tall, one single giant standing pharaoh statue. And that could be moved downriver, obviously a lot easier than upriver. So that's why to me the Colossi of Memnon are more interesting, because if they couldn't have been carried on a boat upriver and pulled with ropes and stuff, then that means they would have been moved over land. And when you look it up on Wikipedia, there's just one little sentence about it. It's like, what the F, like, how do we explain that? Like, people carrying on wooden rollers, some of the largest stones ever carved on Earth, hundreds and hundreds of miles over uneven terrain, over hills, down through valleys, trying to find a navigable path, hundreds of miles away, and then finally erect them up where they stand in this temple. I mean, erecting them and even moving them a mile or so is already just unbelievably incredible, but 400 something miles over land, I've been trying to wrap my head around that for years now.
Yeah, it's one of those problems it's one of the aspects that I think indicate that there's something else going on that we can't answer with the real primitive methods, and that's the logistics issue. Like, it's one of those problems that doesn't scale. It's not like a linear scale of difficulty. Like, once you start getting up over that sort of, you can explain, okay, 100 tons, it's certainly possible, 200, but once you start getting in at 3, 4, 500 tons, 800 tons, 1,000 tons, like, that's a whole, like, you materials fail. Like, this is a whole other issue. Like, we have some examples in relatively modern history, things like the Russian Thunderstone, where they literally moved it on a rolling series of extremely heavy duty steel rails with ball bearings and stuff, and they were carving it as they went, and it took forever. But that seems to be beyond the capabilities of what we know, certainly of the Old Kingdom. But and I think there's actually examples of some of these statues that are not made out of the rose granite, they're made out of other granites that may have come from like the Wadi Hammamet quarry, which is hundreds of miles, like a couple hundred miles away from the Nile, and in valleys and mountains. And there's other quarries for some of this stone that indicates that they were moving very heavy loads across land, not just the colossi, but other objects too. It's a real mystery. Yeah, there seems to have been quite a number of these giant single piece statues, not just the ones at the Colossi of Memnon, but you've got the one at the Ramesseum that's right there as well. Mm-hmm. That's just gigantic. Like, that's another 1,000-ton statue. You've got the one at Tanis. You've got ones all throughout the Fayum region. Like, in that, there's Petrie talked about the remnants of a whole bunch of them down there at the Fayum region. It's an insane amount of these huge sort of single piece statues. And you've got to try and comprehend, like, how big was the single piece of stone that they quarried out as well. Like, you've got to carve that thing down to that size. So if you're talking about 1,000-ton statue or 1,100-ton statue finished, I mean, what was it, 1,500 tons when they pulled it out? Maybe more of the block that came out of the quarry that had to be extracted from a hole and then, somehow maneuvered and shaped, I guess. And who knows if that was fully done. There's certainly evidence for a lot of the stonework happening in place. We talk about the Serapeum. I mean, some of the boxes in there, just the boxes are like 50 to 70 tons. They're up to 100 with the lids, but that's insanely tight space. And there's evidence that they worked on them down there. Like, you have boxes in several different stages of finishing down in those tunnels. And the biggest box in the Serapeum has something like a foot of clearance relative to the size of the passages it was moved through, like a foot of clearance. Like, that's how do you turn a corner with that thing? How do you move a 70-ton object through that sort of tight space? You literally cannot pack enough people down there to move that thing around. It's just like, I love the Serapeum. It is my favorite site. It's just because it poses so many of these questions that just challenge our understanding of the past. Like, you can move. I can understand somebody moving a box like that around outside. Like, we can do that. I think it's 70 tons. Difficult but doable. Moving it down into that underground space and turning corners and putting them precisely in the center of those little alcoves, like 6 feet down, and it's just okay. Like, that's a whole other kettle of fish. That, as far as I know, nobody's ever made even an attempt at answering that question. I've yet to see anyone like even try.
I've seen people analyze the. Not actually doing it with any physical block, but analyzing the amount of space around the hallways and the angles that they'd have to be maneuvered in. And they come up with, a pretty solid result that it could be done based on ancient using wooden
Wanna see that
rollers and
demonstrated.
levers. Yeah, I mean, of course, it would be a whole
You
different
can't
thing to
fit the
demonstrate
people
it.
in there. You cannot fit the people in there. Even if we did the numbers, if you say 50-ton box, somebody moves 200 kilograms, it's like 250 people you'd require, and you just cannot fit that number. And that's pulling 200 kilograms. It's an insane amount. You can't do it with. You'd run out of oxygen with that many people down there, and let alone the dust and whatever. It's just, I think that's a tremendous logistical problem. I haven't seen anybody. I'd like to, if there is, send me a link afterwards or something. If somebody's said that they've done some analysis that would claim it can be done, but that's that's how those boxes moved around and then centered in to the lowered down and all that sort of stuff is just.
Yeah, well, actually, one thing we can send you. Did you ever look through Auguste Mariette's original documentation of his archaeological digs there? Because we looked and looked and looked all over the internet. We only found them in French. And it's kind of shitty. It's like, why didn't someone translate that? So actually, I spent like 4 hours a few months ago, and I went through on Google Earth, and I translated the entire
Google Translate.
Or sorry, not Google Earth. Yeah, Google Translate.
Google Translate. Yeah.
I did it like 100 words at a time, or whatever the maximum capacity is of what you can put into Google Translate.
I've been there.
Yeah, so I actually created a PDF document. We were working on a Serapeum video a while ago, and we had to put pause on it for. Life, like I was living in Thailand and I had to move back here. And anyway, the Serapeum video that we had already been working on we had to put pause on it. But we did, translate that document and read through it quite a bit. And actually, one thing that I think you would find very interesting is Auguste Mariette himself found evidence of wooden rollers in the Serapeum. And he found 2 wooden sycamore winches with 8 levers, like a round... kind of wooden crank, like a winch. Mm-hmm. He found 2 of them in there. And I've heard you say in other podcasts with people that Egyptologists don't mention that if they would have found any wood, that they would have been almost bragging about it. We know how it was done.
Underneath.
Yeah, underneath or even in the Serapeum. Yeah, but so interestingly, though, this is the part that really blew my mind. I was reading through this, and Mariette himself found the way that they... lowered the boxes into their chambers in the Serapeum. And what he found was one of the boxes was still up at the walkway level, and it hadn't been lowered. And it was sitting on a whole chamber full of sand. And this is the part that really blows my mind, because he actually went through, and there's those little niches in the corners, or in along the walls of the Serapeum.
In the walls.
Oftentimes the box itself barely fits into the chamber, and then there's like a little niche on each of the 4 sides of the box. Well, you could fit like one person standing in there with a bucket. And so Mariette himself and his team with 4 workers bucketed out all the sand, and they lowered. It was only one box left that wasn't lowered into its position, and they did it themselves. He said it took.
Interesting to know which box that is.
He doesn't say specifically.
I think he does actually. Let me see. Really? Do you want me to share the screen and we can show you the document?
Yeah, we can get into it. I do have to wrap this up.
Okay.
I do have to get out of here in a minute, so we do have to wrap this up. But I'm interested in following up in that, because one thing I'd say about the rollers and stuff is that place was renovated, and I think there's a couple boxes in there that the dynastic Egyptians were responsible for. The limestone box and the smaller one that's in has that long passageway behind it. Mm-hmm. So yeah, and there was definitely stonework done in there and renovation work, like all the tiling put in there and stuff like that as well. But that's interesting. I hadn't heard that account. I'd be interested if you've got a translation of it. I'd love to see it.
Yeah, I'll send it to you. You'll have to just type, and we might even put it in the show notes of this video so people can download it. And if you just type in the word lever, Lever, you'll find. I think it's the second time it mentions that in the document, and it shows how
I've got a French friend. He can help me with the original.
Oh, cool. Yeah, it's a bit jumbled because Google Translate kind of, shuffles words around in funny ways. But it was cool. He said that they took great pleasure in lowering the box into its final resting position. And I was just like trying to imagine, 130 years ago or whatever. When was that? 1880s or so? just how magnificent that must have been to like go down in there and actually lower the box into its chamber. So yeah, basically two wooden winches with 8 levers and some evidence of wooden rollers that they found on the main tunnel walkway. And they lowered a box. And those 3 points to me are just incredible. Like, he's basically saying there's no doubt in his mind at all how the Egyptians did it. So, yeah, good point. That brings up the question then is, were all the boxes maneuvered and lowered in that position? Was it just the smallest one? There's a lot of speculation that the lesser galleries in the Serapeum came later on in the history of the Serapeum. And that the main galleries with the giant boxes were perhaps carved, by a more advanced people before them. It's definitely a fascinating site, man. We're working on a video on it now, and that place is just mind-boggling for sure.
Yeah, I'm gonna revisit it myself at some point in the future here, because I've gotten a few more visits in there now from my original series of videos, and that was some of the first ones I've done. I've always kind of wanted to redo them, but yep.
Yeah, you've been back to Egypt now a number of times. We've only been once. And does it get cooler each time you go back? You get to see the sights again?
I always enjoy it.
Get more footage and
every
stuff?
time. Well, yeah, it's a progression, I guess. I've always enjoyed because you go away and noodle on stuff for a while and then come back and take a closer look at this, that, or the other thing. I always have the opportunity to learn something. I don't think I was there. You guys are there for quite a while. I'm usually there for only a couple of weeks at a time, 2 or 3. But yeah, it's always enjoyable going back. Like I always learn something else, and like I said, it's good to come back after you have a year of kind of thinking about it, and then there's stuff you always want to see a little bit more of and get into. Then I'm doing them in tours, which is good fun because it's a good chance to meet people and show them a lot of this stuff as well.
Yeah, that's one thing I was just about to ask. You have another tour planned for there? Is there a way people can look more into that?
Working on it. We are looking at a tour for November. Yes, we're just about to announce it pretty soon here. So keep your eyes peeled. My social medias it'll all come out on my social medias, and I'll mention it in a video whenever I do it. But the itinerary, everything should show up on my website at some point in the near future here. So.
Great.
We already have a pretty good wait list for that one, but it's we are planning to go back in November at this point.
Yeah, it must be pretty cool going from random explorer to YouTube creator to podcaster to now tour organizer.
Well,
it's been a fun progression.
I don't really
to watch.
organize the tours. Yeah, I'm not. I haven't taken that last step yet. I don't run these tours. I'm just a host on them. That's Yusuf's company's job to run them. And I maybe do one a year, but it's been an interesting journey. A little surreal, that's for sure. The whole process has been strange but enjoyable, and I'm very thankful for the chance to get to do it. And seem to like the work, I guess.
It's cool, man. I mean,
trying to get some videos out now.
Yeah, now you're working with the Scablands tours as well, with the Contact at the Cabin and Randall Carlson. I mean, you were driving our van. You were like the van driver when we were riding a few days. That's cool, man. It's like all these opportunities open up, and it's just cool to watch.
Thanks.
So
I'm grateful for those guys for asking me along there.
That tour with Randall has been announced, right? People can go to Contact at the Cabin and find out more about that.
Contactatthecabin.com. Yep, there's a whole bunch of trips, but the ones with Randall are going to be the Idaho Montana trip, and then the Scablands in September. The Idaho Montana one I think is May. Don't quote me though. It's I'm not sure exactly, but it's the only Idaho Montana trip on that list.
Cool. And for anyone who's watching,
if you're interested in those trips.
Yeah, and anyone who's watching this video, go back and watch our video on the channel Scablands, so you can get an idea of all the sites and where they are. Right. And then go out there yourself and just go see them. I mean, they're miracles just sitting there waiting for people to come visit. The Grand Canyon and Mesa Verde and all these places attract millions of tourists, the Yellowstone, Yosemite, but most people have never even heard of the Scablands. And it's one of the most fantastic geological sites you can possibly visit in North America. So if people can go out there themselves, I recommend it. Go see these places. I know it's kind of hard to get to Egypt and stuff, but when I think about all the archaeological sites in the world, I always tell people, if you can manage kind of one trip, just go to Egypt. I mean, Peru is incredible, and so is Jordan and Lebanon, and it's everywhere. But Egypt is really the spot because it was so well preserved in the desert sands, and it's all right there, looking, right in your face. Ancient 4,000-year-old paint and hieroglyphic inscriptions and the most gigantic statues ever made on Earth. And but yeah, so there's so much to see, man, and it's such a fascinating field of research and discovery. And we're happy to chat with you today. Thanks for being on the show. Anything else we want to cover before we wrap it up? Yeah, we should do it again sometime.
No, it's all good. People interested? We should. Yeah, UnchartedX.com for all my stuff, and it's the UnchartedX channel on YouTube.
Yeah.
And you can find lots more detail on all the things that we were talking about, similar to your channel as well. So recommend checking out all of that.
Thanks for all the awesome work you do, Ben. This has been really nice.
Thanks, guys. Cheers.
Well, enjoy your day, my friend, and look forward to talking to you next time.